Are these being developed at a whole range of places throughout Silicon Valley?
No, never mind Silicon Valley. They're being developed in garages. You know, remember, you know, the thing that's wrong with the myth of Silicon Valley, there's two things that are wrong with it. The first thing that's wrong with it is the idea that startups are where the future happens. The future most often happens with crackpots who are pre-startup. You know, by the time the venture capitalists and the startups arrive, the technology is in full swing. You know, when we publish...
Okay, go ahead. Give me an example. What's your best example of that?
Well, I don't know if it's the best example. One that comes to mind. When we first published Make magazine in 2005, you know, the stories were all about these garage inventors who were doing things that looked silly. You know, there was a guy, I think in the first issue, we had a story about a guy who'd built a programmable cat feeder out of an old VCR. Right? He's reusing technology in a creative way. You know, here we are, fast forward 6 years, we've got 100,000 people at Maker Faire in San Mateo. John Doerr is walking around, you know, from the famous venture capitalist, walking around with a notebook. There's a whole bunch of startups doing with innovations in robotics, in manufacturing, in sensors that are, you know, cracking $10 million, you know, and the VCs are starting to flock in. But the whole trend was happening with enthusiasts 5 years ago. Just like the web, when we published about it in 1992, there were only 200 websites. It wasn't like there were VCs all over it. They didn't arrive till 3 years later.
So who knows more of these enthusiasts than anybody else?
Well, the other enthusiasts.
So, I mean, so
this goes back to the following the alpha geeks.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so how do you, I mean, who, I mean, I'm fascinated
by You find interesting people, and then you ask
them
who they think are interesting.
Right. And who they want, and who they want to learn from.
Yeah, and eventually you start to see the clusters and who's interesting, you know, so.
This is the pattern.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And so it's looking for patterns. It's sort of a convergence of patterns in technology and patterns in people. And you know, the people who I find most interesting are usually people who have just great passion. You know, they're really excited about something. And, you know, and then they're not necessarily good business people.
And they not necessarily have a college education, or do?
I don't think it matters. You know, or if they have a college education, it's not necessarily relevant. And I don't mean to say that there aren't people who, you know, go to school, study a discipline, get really good at it, and then go on to do great things. You know, I mean, hey, you know, Mark Zuckerberg was a programmer, although I don't know what he studied. What did he study at Harvard? I have no idea.
I don't know.
You know, but he was a guy.
Bill Gates dropped out.
Yeah, Bill Gates dropped out. Zuck dropped out. And, you know, in each case, they had an idea. You know, and I go back to those beginnings of Microsoft. You know, those early, you know, people at the Homebrew Computer Club were a lot like the people at Maker Faire in 2005.
One of the points that Malcolm Gladwell makes is that what happens is you get in early on something, you spend the requisite 10,000 hours, and Gates had access to that computer in the library.
Yeah.
And he and Paul Allen knew each other, and therefore they got in early to, not got in early in terms of business application, but they got in early in terms of the kind of enthusiasm you are suggesting, so that when Paul Allen comes to Bill in first year at Harvard and says, it's taken off, get the hell out of here, and so they went to Albuquerque then.
I think that I think the 10,000 hours thing certainly has some merit, but
I'm not keying off of
I don't think that it explains anywhere near enough.
So what qualities would these enthusiasts share? They would, one, they'd be a little foolish.
Yeah.
They don't care about convention.
Yeah.
They can think for themselves.
I think the biggest thing is that
they have the passion that we talked about from Wallace Stevens.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
All of that.
Yeah, I think it's all of those things. And they want to make the future happen.
Okay, of any group of 100 of them, how many are going to become Zuckerberg?
Well, I would guess that given that Zuckerberg is so phenomenally successful, 0.
Okay, fair enough. But I mean,
give me a larger set.
All right. I mean, you know the point. I mean, who's going to become a Zuckerberg wannabe who's successful?
I think that's the wrong metaphor.
Okay.
And the reason why, again, I just think.
See, my purpose here.
That's a little bit like asking, who's the next person who's going to win the lottery?
No, it's not. It's not.
Yes, it is. Look at this. How many people do we have on the scale of Zuckerberg? You know, in my career, you know, there have been maybe 4 or 5 companies over 20, 30 years that are created that have that scale of impact. You know, so.
Okay, but I'm not keying off of Zuckerberg.
You got Bill Gates, you got Larry and Sergey, you got Zuck.
But we're not talking, the idea, the question,
Jeff Bezos,
the question does not go to
Steve Jobs.
Okay, we'll come back to all of those guys. The question does not come back, who is that? I mean, the question is, though, it is an interesting one to, if you take 100 people who are enthusiasts, as you've described, whose work product will change the future, let's say. I mean, it may not be the level of Zuckerberg. Whatever the level is, what percentage of them, you know,
again, I'm going to repeat, zero.
Zero.
Okay, the point is, like, take Lee Felsenstein, who was the designer of the Osborne 1.
Right.
Lee didn't go on to become Bill Gates. Bill Gates arrived and went on to become Bill Gates. Somebody else comes along and says, holy shit, there's something really important happening here. And somebody comes in with the skills to turn that into business.
Okay, fair enough. Then you've described a phenomenon. You have described a phenomenon that I'm interested in then.
Yeah. I mean, what's really interesting, you know, is you know, the Wright brothers weren't Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes was Howard Hughes.
Right.
He was an enthusiast too, but he wasn't one of the early guys. He came along a little later. Yeah. You know.
But I understand somebody being able to come along and do that.
You know, once in a generation, you have the early hacker who, you know, the Thomas Edison who turns into, well, Thomas Edison, or the Henry Ford who turns into Henry Ford. But you have, for every one of those, you have thousands, tens of thousands of people who are part of this enthusiast wave.
Okay.